been my pleasure to participate. And I have spent, like I said, a full career studying sea otters in nearshore ecosystems, and have participated, if not in the direct translocation, in kind of the monitoring and the study of populations after the translocations. So I'm going to preface that with, or this talk with saying that these are just thoughts, and they're my thoughts and they're my perceptions, and they're influenced by my experiences, and some of them may be true. But these reintroductions have been hugely successful. We don't know the exact number, but probably somewhere around 60 to 70,000 sea otters are a result of these translocations that were conducted several decades ago. If it weren't for the decline in the Aleutians, the proportion that represents wouldn't be nearly so high, but it's probably on the order of 30 or more percent of the world's sea otter populations are a result of these translocations. There's always been high initial loss. You know, the last translocation may have been the least successful in terms of the proportion that were lost. And you know, we all worked on that, trying to design components into the translocation that would reduce that. And I'm not sure why we failed to increase the retention of the animals that we moved. But I think it's worth considering that there may be additional methods and approaches that could reduce that high initial loss rate. Clearly, there's benefits from multiple sources, both in terms of kind of elevating the genetic diversity, but also from kind of that establishment. You know, the single or the double translocations didn't seem to fare as well as those that had more introductions over time. Additive mortality can be an impediment. We had a discussion about the potential for human-induced mortality in the Oregon translocation, and perhaps that was a contributing factor. I think there's pretty good evidence that the most recent translocation to San Nicolas has been adversely impacted by additive mortality. Now, I say that in the broadest sense, and not to point fingers at humans, but in some cases that additive mortality can result from human activity. So I think it's important to consider how ways that might be mitigated in terms of additional translocations. There will be short-term effects, and when I say short-term effects, I mean multi-year short-term effects. So I'm not sure that there's any, you know, immediate effects except on the otters themselves, and maybe the humans that are involved in those. But the kind of the ecological impacts don't take place immediately throughout the area. You know, you put 100 sea otters in Oregon, it's going to be decades before the full impacts, and maybe longer, are realized. And those are those longer term effects. And so we moved 1986, 87, we moved those animals to San Nicolas Island. And here we are 35, 40 years later. It's still difficult to see ecological impacts from that reintroduction. But they will occur. It's just going to take longer. I talked about habitat dimensionality earlier, and there's a couple of aspects to that. California, perhaps the Oregon coast, can be thought of as kind of a single dimension, north to south. But there's also a dimensionality in terms of east and west. And so if you think about sea otter habitat, it can extend, and I haven't looked at your coastline carefully, but it looks to me like sea otter foraging habitat may extend several kilometers, several miles offshore. So there's a dimensionality to their habitat that is important. And then you have this other dimension that goes eastward, I guess, in many cases, you know, these estuaries. And I think those can be very important. So it's just something to think about, and how sea otters will use that habitat, and how that dimensionality will play out in terms of their recolonization. Behavioral and social structure, and I think that this is an underappreciated aspect of their natural history. I tried to speak to the inter-otter relationships, and we have a difficult time understanding them because we don't speak their language. But it's evident. You watch sea otters for a long enough period of time, and you'll see that the same animals rest together on a daily basis. They greet each other in a very consistent way. The sea otter sees the world through its nose, largely, which I think has important implications to reintroductions. If you can put animals in locations where they can sense through their nose other sea otters, I think it'll entice them to explore those relationships. They have strong social and behavioral components to their biology that draws them together. And we see this in these groups of animals, large groups of animals and small groups of animals that are consistent over decadal time series. There's reefs out on Amchitka Island that Carl Kenyon studied sea otters male sea otters that they hauled out on. And I was out there a few years ago and been out there multiple times over the years, and those groups are still there. They're still it's not the same animals. They don't live that long. But they're still using those same habitats in the same ways that they did, groups of males on these same reefs. So we don't understand fully the dimensions to their social structure or their culture, but I think they're important, and I think that it's an avenue for further investigation. Logistic challenges, I don't know if you guys really want to, but these are important. There's permits, and thinking about mitigating conflict resolution before it begins. I think you're all thinking about these things, but these are things that maybe they didn't happen in the early translocations, but they certainly happened in the more recent ones. Capture, handling, holding, transport, and release are all important considerations. Monitoring. We heard about the initial translocations. They put the animals in the water, and then somebody with some interest might have started looking a few years later. Ron was a great example. But there was no systematic monitoring of the system before we put them in there, except at San Nicolas Island. And there wasn't any follow-up monitoring until animals became conspicuous. We protected the animals in 1911, and there were essentially no surveys conducted for the next 40 or 50 years. And that leaves big gaps. And so that brings up this issue of how will you monitor, and what will you monitor? Are you interested in understanding the system before you put this predator back in it? Do you have the breadth and depth of understanding that you need to understand what's going to happen when you put sea otters in there? I don't know, but those are just thoughts for you to ponder. And then once you put them in there, how are you going to monitor them? And how are you going to monitor them over time? When there's only maybe 100 or 10 or 50, it's one thing. When there's several thousand or tens of thousands, it becomes a very different issue. Surveys of population, we talked about those. We didn't really talk too much about monitoring the individuals or the health of the populations. I talked a little bit about it in terms of looking at energy recovery rates. And that's one way to monitor populations in terms of relationship between their prey and the relationship between the otter and their prey at diet and energy recovery intake rates. And then the prey populations are an important aspect. Think about monitoring. How do you define success in a translocation? Talk to Lily. This provides a tremendous research opportunity because you have the capacity, you have a controlled experiment in your hands, and you can take advantage of that and do it in ways that we hadn't thought about in the past. But you have a very powerful experimental design that you can put into play. Translocation studies, baselines, I think I've already talked a little bit about that. Direct and indirect effects, I think we've already talked about. I think we haven't talked too much about the human dimensions, but they're going to be important. They're important now, they'll be important over time, and that's really outside my realm, but I could think about it. And again, that experimental design. And so those are just a few of the things that came to my mind in thinking about my involvement with translocations over the past decade. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to this further discussion on the topic.